Fundraising for nonprofits during COVID and beyond, a discussion on best practices for nonprofit fundraising with real life examples. With me, Kirsten de Jesus, a former CFRE. Thank you for joining me today. It's the beginning of 2021. For most nonprofits and charities and businesses, 2020 was a tough year for fundraising, programming, and business. So let's talk about some things we can start doing or do better to set ourselves up for a stronger year and for our years to come. Because nonprofit work is so important for our communities, and your work needs funding to survive, thrive, and make those necessary changes to incorporate for a different environment that we are now in. Please feel free to ask questions in the comment section throughout this presentation, and I will address them at the end. We have a 30-minute Q&A scheduled. To follow, I will present a general, overarching introduction to fundraising. Let's begin. I'd like to pose a few questions that will help you frame your work and your objectives for fundraising. What do you, and you being your nonprofit, need hard-earned fundraising dollars to do? Are you and everyone connected with your nonprofit able to articulate your need in an elevator pitch? Board members, volunteers, ticket takers, janitors, staff, can they paraphrase your impact in 20 to 30 seconds? Tell me what you do and why it's important. If your charity or nonprofit has a mission and vision statement, I suspect this elevator pitch should be easier. I challenge you either now or after the presentation to say aloud or write down your elevator pitch. To fundraise, when we know exactly why we need funds, it helps us to make a stronger donation ask. Also, when we practice our spiel, so to speak, it makes it more comfortable to do so. Fundraising, like any skill, requires practice, and you know your work like no one else, so you need to be able to sell it. Once you know what your nonprofit on a whole needs funding for, you can target your message for specific exhibits, areas in need of revamping, or other projects in need of support. Your museum needs to move locations. Why is that important or necessary? And how will it help fulfill your work for the community? Why is it important for you to do right now, not later, as soon as possible? A little about me before we dive in. I got into fundraising because I wanted to help people. I volunteered and worked overseas after university, and when I returned to Canada, all the organizations that I loved were hiring fundraisers. So I took a postgraduate degree at Humber in fundraising and volunteer management. From there, I did an internship at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. It is a horribly expensive city to live in, so I decided to return home after my internship, where I found my first position at a grassroots community charity serving Toronto's HIV and AIDS community. They provide practical direct support services in a peer-to-peer environment. I moved on to a West End Toronto hospital during a $100 million capital campaign to support their major gifts efforts. From there, I went to Easter Seals, Ontario to support their corporate sponsorship efforts. At that time, I achieved my certified fundraising executive designation, I took a considerable time to gain this because I wanted a distinction that showed to my employer and to donors that I was approaching that I was passionate about my work and that my expertise was coming from a place of knowing best and ethical fundraising practices. My family and I moved to Kingston in February of 2020 because my husband was offered a job at the hospital. Like many of you, during COVID, I decided to take up a new hobby to fill the time normally occupied with socializing. My husband is Brazilian, so I'm attempting to become fluent in Portuguese. Wish me luck. Me dizer-te sorte. Note about this presentation, all resources and extra links are consolidated at the end. How to fundraise. Listed in no particular order, but starting with forms of fundraising that help a nonprofit acquire new donors, and ending with the types of fundraising that sustain our work, major giving and bequests. Getting to know your donors is key. so that you can ask them for the right gifts in the right way at the right time. How do they like to give? Are your donors mailing in checks, or are they comfortable giving online, or even via mobile giving? I ask these questions because if we don't know the answers, consider start looking for the trends. And if we do know the answers, I suggest tracking the methods of giving in a manner that informs how we structure our fundraising programs going forward. More on this later. Not all fundraising is like the other. Some methods closer to the top of the list that I provided can have a lower return on investment, or ROI. Events, for example, can be a fantastic way to introduce new prospective donors to your cause, but do consume a large amount of staff time and funds to get together. So if you're doing events, ensure that you're doing so not only to 1, raise funds now, but 2, raise funds later. Capture all contact information from your attendees and volunteers so that you can contact them and ask them to continue their support after the event. 3, your event should help to educate the public about your cause. And lastly, 4, help to recruit volunteers and future committee members. Events are fun and something to look forward to, but are hands down the most taxing mode of fundraising for any fundraiser because of their unpredictability. Particularly during COVID, I think any event planner would tell you all about their frustrations. I myself, although not loving fundraising or not loving events as a sole fundraising method, love attending events. For instance, I had a dress all picked out ready to go for a hospital event here in Kingston that was scheduled to take place in May of 2020. I still have not worn that dress. I look forward to when we are able and excited to attend events again, to support the charities we care about, and to wear my dress. Learn all about the ways the University Hospital Kingston Network here in Kingston is raising funds and what for. In any of your fundraising efforts, make sure it's evident to donors in your communications all the ways that they can give. Make it as easy as possible to donate and follow the money and the lowest hanging fruit. Who is giving to you? Make sure you keep asking those individuals, grants, or government entities or groups, and also ask people like them who might also be receptive. COVID fundraising. Yes. Like most businesses and families with school-aged children and the elderly in long-term care facilities under lockdown, we are all being forced to be creative to survive and thrive. Being slightly dramatic, but not in the case of nonprofits, charities, and businesses. Unless we have diversified our funding, it's going to be very tough to continue. We've definitely lost a few of our avenues for fundraising in connection with the community. And for most nonprofits, your doors are closed again, so we may not be top of mind to our donors. And we might be missing quite a few funding streams: ticket sales, new memberships, gift shops, coin collectors, etc. So if you haven't already, it's time to get creative. How can you reach your donors to keep them up to date on what you're doing, even if you are closed? How can we ask for funds? How can we continue to make our supporters feel involved? Ideas to come. For instance, did you know the best time to ask a monthly donor to upgrade their gift is 9 to 12 months after their first gift? If a donor becomes a member or monthly donor, are you asking them to upgrade their support? Perhaps tie that into your fundraising plan for 2021. One of the fundamentals of fundraising is to test it. If you have an idea, give it a go. We can't know what will work for our unique nonprofits unless we give it a shot. A general fundraising note: it is always more effective to suggest an amount than to leave it open-ended or blank in our solicitations. Be specific. For example, please consider increasing your gift by $10 a month. As well, if you have an option for online giving, ensure you are using preset amounts for giving. For instance, 25, 55, 105. This rule applies all the way up to your major donors. Donors want to help, but they need to know what their money is going towards. So and they want their money to make a difference. If you're approaching a particular major donor for a specific reason, be specific. I need $11,205.11 to create a new gallery in dedication of exotic butterflies. One way to think of your relationship with your donor is as a long-term relationship. Donors make their first gift, hopefully their second gift, and after many years of commitment, ideally a major gift or a bequest or planned gift. You can use these steps as a goal to structure fundraising asks, follow-up, thank yous, stewardship, and future solicitations. Think of every donor as someone who needs your encouragement. Something that I like to think about is the appeals I get from previous boards I sat on. The executive director was an absolute sweetheart. And she worked so hard. She asks me annually to give to their fundraising walk that they do every fall. And I think, oh, I should definitely give. But I've noticed in terms of my own behavior, unless the ED follows up with me directly, I forget to give. If, however, in the years that she does write back again after her initial solicitation and says, Kirsten, I haven't seen your gift. Are you able to give? I feel guilty that I forgot to give to her initial solicitation, and I immediately go through and I make a donation to this organization right away. So I encourage you to not be shy and to remind people of their ability to support your work. Donors truly want to help. They just might be a little absent-minded and busy like myself. Going back to the second gift moment in the donor timeline, what can I do to make sure my donor who is given to me for the first time gives again? I would recommend 1, say thank you for their gift. 2, send them information on how their gift made a difference. 3, ask them for another gift at the appropriate time. And 4, invite them to something that engages them in your work. This might be a little tricky right now because we're not doing things in person. However, I've seen very creative examples from charities engaging their donors in events or educational pieces that helps them stay in touch with what is going on and what their donations are making possible. COVID fundraising continued. This slide is attempting to address what nonprofits can do to offset any lost income from COVID and what we can do better. Because I'm an optimist and I think it's helpful, I consider learning to be a lifetime endeavor. Let's diversify our fundraising efforts. Likely, if you had all of your eggs in one basket, event fundraising, for example, I'm sorry, these are tough times requiring a lot of agility and creativity. In any case that you are in, make sure you let your donors know that you need funds and exactly what for. Don't forget to ask. If you are sending communications, include a call for support and include how they can give. Website, mail, text, car pickup if you're very agile. Remember the why, what, and how of your work. Something I've seen charities do well in the past while since COVID is to transition physical-based events into virtual events that still require peer-to-peer fundraising. The CN Tower Climb for United Way, for instance, 2020 marked their first ever virtual physical challenge, 280 minutes active minutes. For museums, I've seen previously in-person events become virtual education talks, with or without fees associated. The other thing I've been very pleased to see is COVID-specific wording that shows a sensitivity to the fact that many are struggling financially. For example, if you are able to give at this time, we appreciate your support, because some donors may not be able to give. When it comes to soliciting public or private foundations for grants, consider calling them in advance. Always a good way to establish friendships with the administrator, but also in this particular moment in time to ask them if they have any changes that have occurred to their giving preferences as a result of COVID. Have they redirected funds to COVID cases? If you are using templates for your solicitations, consider updating them to reflect the state of your nonprofit since COVID. Highlight how you have adapted to serve the community. Another suggestion I have is to not be shy to set up a Zoom or Google Meet session with your generous or major donors. What defines a major donor? A gift given occasionally that exceeds their ongoing annual support. On average, over 88% of all nonprofit funds come from just 12% of donors. So it might be helpful for you and your group to constitute what is a major gift or a major donor, and start potentially talking to your givers. They will be people who have given regularly for a number of years, typically. Donor information. If you don't have your donors' information tracked and stored that's searchable, it will make it harder to fundraise, especially during COVID when foot traffic and events aren't happening. Also, if you aren't trying to fundraise from people who have already given, then you're spending more money than you need to. Acquiring new donors is much more expensive than retaining donors who have already given to you. A note on permission to contact. If a donor asks to be removed from a mailing or call list, as a nonprofit, you need to be able to do that as soon as possible and ensure that your tracking platform allows you to adjust for donor contact preferences. In terms of legislation, CASEL was established in 2014 to deal with spam. It's meant to help Canadian individuals, businesses, and organizations deal with spam. And all Canadian organizations must comply with the Act, including nonprofits and charities. A few points of interest and importance for nonprofits as it comes to CASEL. Only fundraising emails sent for the primary purpose of raising funds for the charity are exempt. Commercial electronic messages must have an unsubscribe function, and they must clearly identify the organization. So include your name, your mailing address, your email, and your phone number. If people signed up for your newsletter directly, it's okay to continue communicating with them, but you do need written or oral permission before you can add people to other lists. In terms of consent and what CASEL defines consent as, it's anyone who's agreed to receive commercial messages, verbal consent at an event, signing up for an email using an online form, has an active or existing relationship with you within 2 years of most recent contact, previously bought an event ticket or are a client or a member, you made an inquiry to the organization within 2 years, all define consent, and nonprofits can send commercial communications to people who match one or all of the above criteria. Information for smaller groups, but it really applies to all groups. Capture information about a donor that only you know, you the individual fundraiser or you the organization, so that you aren't the only one who knows. If you know, for instance, a Miss Shiitake's favorite mushroom is shiitake, and they love to cook with it and to paint with it, and it reminds them of foraging for them with their grandparents when they were little, and it reminds them of your exhibit about mushrooms, include that in their donor record. Why? Because if a mushroom exhibit needs to be overhauled, perhaps Mrs. Shiitake is an appropriate donor for that exhibit. Be prepared to take suggestions into account by donors who you're asking for funds from. This slide is entitled Ask Debbie at CAM. Software options come in all shapes and sizes and will be very specific to your needs in your group. But a donor management software is going to be critical for tracking your donor information. The benefit of these platforms is that they can capture all the information about the donor and make their gifts, size of gifts, date of last gift searchable. So if you are at any point, you can start being very precise on who you're mailing, who you are targeting for gift upgrades, and what their preferences for contact are. If you are contacting your donors, you need to be able to capture whether or not they want to be contacted by mail, by phone, or by email. The functionality of software includes tax receipting, creating mailing lists, creating email lists, saving contact preferences, tracking attendance at events, processing monthly donations. Many can connect with other software for various accounting and data analysis functions. They can connect constituents in your records to indicate family connections, board connections, mushroom connections, etc. So if you're looking for a software option that might be slightly discounted, you can contact Debbie and she can let you know the full range of options that are available for you through TechSoup. And now on to the culture of philanthropy. Philanthropic culture is a subset of organizational culture. A culture of philanthropy refers to your organization's attitude towards philanthropy and fund development. Some people define philanthropy as the voluntary action for the common good. As a nonprofit organization, an essential part of your organizational culture should ideally include philanthropy. Organizations that operate with a culture of philanthropy understand three things: the value of organizational culture, the importance of philanthropy, and the inextricable link between philanthropy and fund development. To me, this means that everyone from the volunteer to each and every employee plays a part in the organization's success to fundraise. Essentially, everyone in the organization has a role to play. And everyone is an ambassador. Being an ambassador means doing one's job well, understanding how all the various jobs in the organization create one integrated system, and most importantly, treating all of the organization's customers, clients, donors, volunteers, community people with care and respect. When I attended fundraising and volunteer management at Humber, I was told the best practice was 100% board and staff giving. It was paramount. Funders asked for it, and we should be able to deliver that. And some funders may still ask whether your group has 100% board and staff giving. However, I think with all the work being done on race, representation, and equity, this expectation is hopefully changing because it demonstrates the value of money above all else. Perhaps instead, nonprofits can toot their stats to show their commitment to volunteerism, their number of volunteers, their number of members. Being asked or forced to donate to a charity isn't a decision that will work its way up to a major gift. I think a donation needs to be given wholeheartedly. However, having said that, I have been very motivated to fundraise for organizations that have worked hard to acquire generous boards of directors. When I was at PWA, board members were generous with their expertise, time, and with fundraising. I specifically remember certain board members riding their bikes from Toronto to Montreal to support our efforts to fundraise and to show their commitment to all the participants, bless their hearts. For major giving, something I have found interesting in my studies was that the best ask comes from either a friend involved with the cause, with the executive director of the organization, and or a board member. I know for me, it's easier to ask for funds when I am myself a donor. I also prefer giving to a charity when a friend is asking me to give because they feel so strongly about the work being done. Keep this in mind when you're asking for funds. Who is the best person to make the ask, especially if it's a larger gift? Is the person connected with the funder? Do they know them personally? Or do they have a direct connection with the cause? A note about boards of directors and how to make them philanthropic. Your board should have a diverse background. It would be helpful if some were able to give financially, but also seek to have individuals who have a lived experience with your museum or focus of interest. Otherwise, over time, a nonprofit managed from disconnected management risks becoming irrelevant. I included a book suggestion about boards of directors in the resources slide, but it's appropriate for smaller groups. This slide on community opinions. Our ability to fundraise is dependent on whether our organizations are well regarded. One of the most important ways from a fundraising perspective we can do that is to ensure that our fundraising is above board. Use your donor dollars for what we say we are doing with them. If a donor gives towards your programming, ensure that every dollar contributes to your programming. If a donor during a capital campaign wants to support the donor atrium, make sure their dollars support the atrium. Can you brainstorm some ways that you can involve the local or regional press to cover your activities to create some goodwill towards your work? Could you celebrate a specific volunteer or a volunteer group? Think of ways to show off your good work, and this will be very specific, obviously, to your organization. Back to bad press and how damaging it can be. In 2006, MAD Canada, which is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, had bad press concerning their use of fundraising dollars. CFRE was involved as they claimed money was being used for charitable purposes, while instead it was more towards advocacy. These sort of concerns are damaging to the whole sector, but particularly to the individual organization. I didn't have a connection to them at that point, but I had, of course, seen their ads on TV. It wasn't until years later that I became a fundraiser, but I've never given to MAD, and I certainly haven't forgotten the bad press. In MAD's case, they were using funds towards lobbying and educating the public instead of towards its programs, which were directed towards victim services and fighting against drunk driving. It is challenging to fundraise if we don't either have good press or have been cast in shadow due to poor management or handling charitable dollars poorly, because that's going to be a conversation that comes up with every single ask. Ensure that funds are being used for what donors think they're being used for. One of the ways we can gain good standing is by communicating with donors and the community and tell them how their dollars are being used. Okay, so most of us can't praise our high numbers of attendees to our museums this year, but how did we creatively engage our communities, and how can we communicate that to gain good regard at this point in time? Donor recognition is an action or an item used by your nonprofit to show thanks and appreciation for donor support. It's a celebration of your relationship with your donor. It can be a letter, it can be an event, it can be a token of appreciation, a donor listing, or a naming opportunity. Donor recognition provides inspiration to the general donor audience. It sets an example of philanthropy and engages donors to continue giving or even to make a first gift. A donor recognition event can also create an opportunity for good press. One note about recognition: it should be made in proportion to the donor's generosity, because otherwise precedent can get tricky. At Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London, where I completed my internship for my postgraduate degree, on my first day I was given a tour and shown permanent outdoor floor tiles with inscriptions of donors' names, some who had made donations as low as £250, if my memory serves. The point was that it was an incredibly low bar for a permanent installation in lieu of recognition. Taking back naming opportunities is very tricky and truly risks damaging the donor relationship. Make sure the naming opportunities are thoughtful, with consideration for future changes to the establishment. New donor wall installations that are digital are trending because the cost to change a donor wall is highly lessened, and updates take minutes rather than months to reprint. These should be placed prominently on site, but perhaps given COVID, we can also consider more creative ways to recognize our donors, whether online or within our general communications. Let's feature generous donations in the newsletters and talk about why they give and why our donors think our work is important. It sounds even better coming from donors than from the mouths of our educators and board members. As well, another thought is perhaps we can involve our donors in the creation of fundraising decisions to make sure that their wishes are being met, obviously within reason. The importance of knowing your donor will help you to structure a strong fundraising program that ensures you are using your time and resources effectively. It will also help to make sure you don't leave any dollars out on the table. Do you know how your supporters like to give to you? Do you know who is accessing your website and where they are from geographically? How can we continue to ask our donors while branching out to reach new donors in the ways they might most like to give? This is kind of a question about generational giving. Because as our donors age, ideally it would be good to replace them with newer supporters. At Easter Seals Ontario, the largest stream of income was coming from bequests. A bequest is a gift made in one's last will and testament. This was amazing because we were receiving year after year $1 million bequest from said donor. But it was also a concern because we didn't know when these gifts were coming in. We didn't have a planned giving officer tracking and stewarding the relationships. So the organization on whole was looking to ensure those donations kept coming in, but also diversify so that if those unexpected bequests stopped coming in, we would be able to sustain our programming for children with physical disabilities. I'm going to get into the science of fundraising, which may or may not be where your nonprofit are at, but this stuff is fascinating and it can, at some stage, support your efforts. Fundraising success matrix, my apologies, are key performance indicators. They act as analytical tools you can use to determine the effectiveness of your efforts. These include cost per dollar raised. How much did it cost you for your nonprofit to raise $1? You divide the expense by revenue for the fundraiser. For example, if you held an event that cost $500 and you raised $2,000, it cost you 25 cents on the dollar, which would be considered your fundraising cost. If you start tracking this, you can determine year over year how a fundraising effort is serving you. There are dozens of things to track, but one that I think is important is your donor retention rate. Does your organization track how many donors it retains on a year-to-year basis? As I mentioned, acquiring new donors is more expensive than maintaining the ones you have. And in this case, it can also relate to membership as well. Are you able to retain the members that you have? Going back to knowing your donor. Before launching a campaign, take the time to craft your message to those you are hoping to gain support from. What is your fundraising campaign about? Who is it for? And why do you need the funds now? Make your appeal urgent because donors want to help with what needs help the most. That's why when a natural disaster happens, donations go up for organizations like the Red Cross, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders. If you're finding it hard to clarify your message, perhaps consider putting in time to draft a case for support. Case for support is a straightforward document that tells prospective donors what your organization hopes to accomplish with their philanthropic gifts. This will help you to clarify your message and bring other practical information into one place with clear and consistent messaging. The case will communicate to the relevant audiences your passion for your mission. Side note, a mission statement is typically 1 to 3 sentences that sums up the essence of your work. It should explain why your charities and nonprofits. How are we the same and how are we different? According to the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, registered charities and nonprofits both operate on a nonprofit basis. However, they are not the same. Charities are exempt from paying income tax, and most supplies are GST and HST exempt. Charities using the resources for charitable activities, which include relief of poverty, advancement of education, advancements of religion, other purposes benefiting the community. Only registered charities can issue tax receipts. You can only meet one definition, not both, and charities must spend a minimum amount on its own charitable activities annually. Nonprofits do not need to operate only for charitable purposes. They can support pleasure, sport, recreation, social welfare, civic improvement, any purpose except for profit. Occasionally, nonprofits will partner with a charitable partner who can accept donations on their behalf, someone whose mission aligns very closely with your own. Keep in mind, it's typical that a small percentage is deducted from the donation as a processing fee. The CRA has identified 4 kinds of charity and non-charity partnerships: contractor relationship, agent relationship, a joint venture, and a cooperative venture. The essence is that the charity is using an intermediary to carry out a charity's activities within Canada. These partnerships involve the transfer of a charitable dollars from a charity to a non-charity. The transfer of funds is not a grant, but an arrangement where the charity must retain control over how the money is spent to reflect the charity's charitable program. It is important to emphasize that the partnership between charities and non-charities is a legal relationship. Under CRA guidelines, the charity must monitor, regulate, and control the funds. The charity must retain direction and control of the charitable funds, and the activities of the non-charity must align with the charity's mandate and contribute to the achievement of that mandate. But in this way, a nonprofit could issue tax receipts for donations if the charity was in agreement. Is it possible that your organization has a larger entity that's charitable who you could partner with? What's next? Here we go. Here are some things I hope will be fruitful for your organization. If you don't have a fundraising plan for 2021, come up with a calendar of when you will ask for support, how and what your goals will be. Incorporate your donor and supporter updates, which include your newsletters, your emails, your physical mailers, and perhaps consider trying something new this year. Give your donors a call to say thanks. Utilize volunteers. Promote a giving day. The process of planning your year can help organize and frame your strategy for meeting your fundraising goals and ensure that they're attainable. Do you have time for these pieces? More on that to come. What can you offer to your supporters and potential supporters that will make life enjoyable or educational for them while they're at home? Even when lockdowns are over, people will still be hesitant to resume regular activities. And vaccination rollouts so far are not guaranteed. Can you take an educator or volunteer during an exhibit? Or is there something that might be appropriate for kids? Something I found so nice during all the COVID shutdowns and lockdowns, our charities are not-for-profit companies providing opportunities for parents with kids who are either homeschooling or less social or just aren't as involved with face-to-face activities, virtual events or activities for outdoors. Is there a way that you can continue your outreach to your supporters or donors remotely? My daughter's old music school is sending weekly relief packages with musical options and videos to explore with my child. My suggestion is to create an opportunity to build community. Another example is the ROM is offering a weekly session for kids that incorporates art, stories based on an exhibit in the ROM. For adults, they are addressing the issues of race and Indigenous peoples through taped podium talks. My next suggestion is to share powerful stories. In your communications with donors, express how their support is helping the community. What are the expected positive impacts of the project or initiative you wish to fund? Get permission from a volunteer who wants to share why they've volunteered with your museum for 20 plus years. Next is membership. Could it be time to revisit your membership fees and recognition? Can you create new levels at higher price points, or simply increase your annual membership fees to incorporate inflation while adding something comparable in the way of recognition? Data-driven. According to Charity Village, data and performance metrics will help guide your organization to make informed decisions, increase fundraising revenues, and increase the efficiency of how your organization runs. This definitely can take time, but why not start now and begin a worthwhile endeavor to know that you are making fundraising decisions based on data that are best for your group? This step might begin with tracking your donations, capturing the contact information of volunteers, board members, past and current, and your members. Something else you might be needing at this point is encouragement. You can do this. Your work is so important, and if you can communicate that, donors will step up and help you. Consider this a COVID-free pat on the back of encouragement to the truly important work you do for the community in all the many hats that you may or may not wear at your nonprofit. When to outsource? I was encouraged to incorporate information around this for your group. After creating a fundraising calendar that takes into account your other programs, organizational plans, responsibilities, staffing, and skill sets, are you meeting your fundraising goals? If you simply don't know where to start, it might be time to do one of three things. Consider hiring a fundraiser, part or full-time. Work with volunteers on the programs that you know you'd like to do but just don't have the time or resources to accomplish. Or third, hire a consultant or outsource. As a professional fundraiser, I'm always keen to have organizations engage with professionals who are passionate about your work so that the individual is representative of your work and becomes a spokesperson. If you're still finding yourself unable to handle time-consuming tasks to do with fundraising, could you utilize volunteers? At PWA, I had volunteers working in teams to fold direct mail pieces, put them in envelopes, and run them through the mail machines for postage. I also utilized volunteers to make thank you calls to donors on a monthly basis. This was on the recognition side. Once a month, a willing volunteer would come in. I would provide a list of donors to call. I would provide them with talking points, which we would go over and do trial calls with to build confidence. And afterwards, the volunteers would report back on any feedback from donors or whether the donor was unreachable, in which case we would try again next time. In advance of the volunteering, I would have the volunteers sign a code of conduct to protect donor information and confidentiality. In regards to the third option, there are literally so many options for consultant fundraisers and companies. They can do anything from write direct mail for you to plan strategy, to help you with your corporate fundraising. So there's just so much that can be supported or created for you. Just be aware that outsourcing can require a good amount of management. Contractors will need a lot of support from you initially to get them up to speed, all the information they will need to craft their appeals or projects. And you will also want to, throughout their contract, manage their time and the costs associated. In the next slide, I've included a list of resources, and within that is an association of fundraising professional suppliers. When I've been a full-time fundraiser, I've always been a member of the AFP Toronto chapter. And I think that utilizing services or consultants that have been recommended is always best. And AFP pushes for ethical fundraising. In general, I personally look down upon commission-based compensation for fundraisers for the following reasons. It encourages aggressive short-term behavior by fundraisers that may undermine the reputation of the charity. And I'm in fundraising to support charities and nonprofits, not for my own personal gain. Contracted and commission-based fundraisers can also tend to alienate donors, and it can also create morale problems for the other staff in an organization. For example, those on the front lines delivering the charitable services who might be paid far less. Best to hire people who care about your mission and pay them a fair salary. Within the AFP guidelines, which I agree with. Members shall not accept compensation or enter into a contract that is based on a percentage of contributions, nor shall members accept finder's fees or contingent fees. I would consider, or I would propose that you consider within your job posting or consultant search, look for individuals or companies who are AFP members or are certified as a CFRE. If you're going to work with a professional fundraiser, make sure the relationship with the donor is with you, with a nonprofit. Fundraisers really should not be expected to come to a charity with a Rolodex because the relationship is with the cause, not the individual fundraiser. A nonprofit's donors are theirs, and it's the organization's job to steward them. And that could be in many, many faces of people that are connecting with them. One thing my professor at Humber would repeat over and over is that all donor conversations and information should be kept somewhere safe, because heaven forbid you, the fundraiser, or the executive director, or whoever is doing the fundraising for the organization, are hit by a bus. Those records belong with the cause. So in your exchange with your contractor or outsourced fundraiser, you need to make sure that all those donor touch points are captured. When were they mailed something? What were they mailed? When were they called? What was said? Was there any feedback, etc.? When you've decided outsourcing is right for you, make sure that you choose the right partner. Providers should be selected for their expertise in working within the nonprofit sector and should hopefully demonstrate awareness of relevant legal and regulatory requirements. Look for someone who is skilled with the technology that you're currently using to solicit your donations, and ensure that you're monitoring the performance of your partners closely to ensure that their efforts align with your mission, your internal efforts, and your fundraising goals. This can be a little bit technical, but that always happens with government entities. The CRA for charities states the following, and I've included a link in the next resource slide. A registered charity should undertake a reasonable process in light of its resources and the size of its contract to identify and select a supplier to provide the required goods or services at a cost reflecting no more than the fair market value. So in saying this, it's good practice to do at least some of the following, which I'm going to state that the CRA is recommending. Research fundraising methods and procurement options. Select bids from 3 or more potential suppliers. Issue a request for proposal. Carefully review all terms of contracts to ensure that they are reasonable. Include provisions to terminate a contract if the third party acting on behalf of the charity does not act in compliance with the provisions of this guidance, and limit the length of contracts, particularly when signing an initial contract, to ensure that your partner is doing what you need them to do and it's a good fit. Important considerations. Where fundraising activities carried on as a staff function, the staff should make adequate effort to ensure that compensation paid does not result in employees receiving excessive benefits. The salary for any fundraising position should never exceed the fair market value for the services provided. So look around. What are other charities posting their salaries at? It's quite easy to find that information online if you search for it. Alternatively, if you decide you are willing and able to do the work in-house, take a course, seek out opportunities. Locally, St. Lawrence offers fundraising programs. I've never done them, but they might be great. Build professional development into your fundraising calendar for the year so that you won't forget. And obviously, you're already on top of that because you signed up for today's course. Congratulations. Resources and questions. A book recommendation to start, Great Boards for Small Groups by Andy Robinson. Recommendation to Google your fundraising questions. Fundraisers really are a generous bunch and many have free newsletters. Just be aware that some of them are US based, so just be aware if the content changes as it applies to Canadian use. Next link is for the CRA, more specific information about the difference between charities and nonprofits and their similarities. Crowdfunding. If you're feeling inspired to try something new, maybe you are excited about reaching out to a new group of supporters, Follow this link to learn more about crowdfunding and how it's proving very profitable. Getting more gifts at smaller price ranges. And my biggest recommendation is that you use captivating visuals. Charity Village could prove a good resource for recruiting volunteers, board members, or for posting positions. Borrow ideas from others doing what you are doing or something similar by signing up for their free newsletters, and note how they state their organizational name, contact info, and the option to opt out of their commercial messages. The next is a link to Ontario funding and financial assistance. Are you assessing all the support you can from the government? If they are offering it, let's not waste that opportunity. AFP Toronto suppliers, if you need to outsource for your fundraising needs, maybe start with these suppliers as options. The next is a link for a discussion on commission-based fundraising to further support the conversation we had about outsourcing your work. I think commission-based fundraising is a little more prevalent to the US because they have so many more charities, but it's still good to be aware of when negotiating your contract. And lastly, feel free to message me any specific questions about my material via email at lori.kristen@gmail.com. Thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. Wishing you the best with your fundraising efforts. I look forward to seeing how the Kingston Association of Museums thrive in the years to come. Keep up the good work. All the best. And now to your questions.